So when people say that they're libertarian in how they're understanding, so they believe that in essence, anything that would force them to make a choice then would not be a free choice. So it's kind of hard to think of someone who believes that, because if you look just at our world today, how many things influence us to make choices. It seems like you're already trying to make when you talk about physics, you always try and make the world without without a friction or gravity to make the math work better. But here it seems like it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, so it might be good, Scott, if we can step back for just a minute and maybe lay out the terms here so that folks understand exactly what we're talking about. Because you're right, these are relatively, in terms of the history of philosophy and especially theology, relatively new terms. So compatibilism, my guess is many people have probably never even heard of that. And of course, libertarianism, most people, as you say in your book, if you ask people on the street, they would say, of course I have free will,
Right,
So
right.
maybe you can kind of lay out, the distinctions between those terms, and then maybe tell us why libertarianism, why that doesn't seem to work from your perspective.
Yeah, so when most people use the term free will, they probably have something in mind along the lines of what libertarian free will teaches. And so even if you go back to Augustine in the 4th century and the what is known as the Pelagian controversy, in which he dealt with this question of free will, the term free will itself has been used throughout the ages, and not just among Christians either. This has been a question among secular philosophers as well.
Right.
Basically, the idea of libertarian free will, especially as it's carefully defined by theologians of the Arminian persuasion, is usually associated with Arminianism, open theism, even Molinism. These terms your audience may not be familiar with, but these are positions that are taken by those that embrace this notion of libertarian free will. And basically it has two ideas. The first idea is that any choice that we make cannot be sufficiently determined by any factors whatsoever, including God himself. So in order for a choice to be free, it cannot be in any way determined or have some ultimate cause other than our own freedom of choice. So it must be a choice that is generated independently by ourselves and have no connection to any other determining factors. So that'd be the first plank of libertarian free will, and that is the most common distinction, you might say, of somebody who holds to this notion of libertarian free will.
So the idea there is that we just make our choices kind of arbitrarily, and there's no causal factors other than that we just made the choice.
Yes, and that's an important. You introduced the word arbitrarily. Most people who espouse free will wouldn't say that their choices are arbitrarily made.
Right.
But if there are no sufficient causes for why a choice is made, then ultimately it boils down to, well, I just decided to do this. I don't know why I did it.
Yeah.
And that can become a problem if you cannot point to sufficient reasons for why you made a particular choice. So, and it's important to understand that when we're talking about the idea of choices being determined or there being reasons for choices, that there is a human component, or an earthly component, we might say, circumstances, your own internal desires and things like that may have an impact on the choices that you make, but they aren't sufficient causes for those choices. In other words, you might have a certain inclination to choose, blonde-haired girls, or something like that. But you always have the freedom to act against that. that particular, desire that a person might have. And
So,
that leads to the second plank,
yeah.
that it's
Just
important
before you get there,
sure.
Scott. So is that the distinction that you've made between reasons and causes with regard to choices?
Yeah, I'm not trying to draw too sharp of a distinction between
Okay.
reasons and causes.
Right.
I use those terms somewhat synonymously. Just,
Okay.
the thing that people need to understand is that if you get deep into the philosophical literature on this topic, sometimes the distinctions are so sharp and so many that you get confused in a
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
Overwhelmed.
yeah, it's very easy to get overwhelmed in this topic, and there's just a ton of material written on it at a very high level philosophical, level that many people would just be completely overwhelmed. But so yeah, when I use the terms, causes or reasons, usually I'm using those terms somewhat synonymously in the book.
Okay.
But so that would be the first plank, that our choices cannot be sufficiently determined by anything, and that particularly includes God himself.
Mm.
We cannot say that God determines our choices, otherwise we're not really free. And there's reasons why people who espouse libertarian free will say that, and I can get to that in a moment.
Okay.
But let me just mention the second plank. The second plank is the idea that you could choose in opposing directions in the same circumstances. So let's say that you're walking down the road and you come to a fork in the road. You could easily choose to go right as you could to go left. And if you replayed that whole scenario and all the circumstances were exactly the same, one moment you might choose the left-hand road and the other moment you might choose the right-hand road. And so this is called, contrary choice, or the possibility of alternative choices.
Mm-hmm.
So that freedom of will means that you could have equally chosen A or chosen not A. You could have chosen A or you could have chosen B. And there's no sufficient causal reasons as to why you would choose one or the other except your own freedom to do so.
Okay.
And so that's the basic definition of libertarian free will. And so let me just make one other point about that. One of the reasons why people who espouse free will, Arminians and open theists and whatnot, is because they assume that if God determines our choices, then they must be coercive.
Right.
In
They're
other words,
forced, right?
God must be forcing us to act
Yeah.
against our will.
Yeah.
And that's an assumption that is made about the Calvinist position, which is what I espouse in the book, that somehow Calvinism means that God coerces us or forces us to act against our will. And there's no Calvinist that ever said that.
Right.
And that is certainly not what the Bible teaches.